President Sisi stresses regional stability coordination. Washington dismisses Iranian claims of successful attacks on U.S. Gulf bases. And the IRGC says armed forces remain on maximum alert amid U.S. tensions. Good morning, everyone. It's 9 a.m. here in Cairo. You're watching Qnews. I'm Hani Saif, and these are the news today. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has reaffirmed Egypt's strong appreciation for its strategic partnership with the United States, stressing the importance of close coordination to promote stability in the Middle East and confront shared challenges, particularly terrorism and extremism. Speaking during a meeting with a delegation from the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, President Sisi called for advancing bilateral ties across political, economic and investment fields. The delegation praised Egypt's regional role and efforts to de-escalate tensions, including support for U.S.-Iran negotiations. The Egyptian leader also underscored the need for a just and comprehensive resolution to the Palestinian cause, based on international legitimacy, and the two-state solution is the only path to lasting peace. The U.S. military said Iranian missiles launched towards Kuwait and Bahrain failed to hit their targets as regional tensions continue to escalate. The U.S. Central Command said ballistic missiles fired towards Kuwait and Bahrain either fell short or were intercepted by American and Allied air defenses. CENTCOM also announced strikes on Iran's Qishm Island in response to what it described as attempted missile and drone attacks across the region. Kuwaiti authorities later reported intercepting additional missiles and drones, while Bahrain said warning sirens were activated and urged residents to move to safe locations as a precaution. Moreover, Washington dismissed Iranian claims of successful attacks on key American military positions in the Gulf region. The U.S. Central Command said Iranian missile and drone operations against American assets in the Gulf did not achieve their objectives. The statement came after Iranian media claimed Revolutionary Guard forces targeted the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, as well as other military assets in the region. According to CENTCOM, American and Allied defenses responded to the attacks, while regional tensions continue to rise following recent exchanges between Tehran and Washington. The U.S. military struck an oil tanker in Gulf waters as Washington tightened pressure on Iran amid ongoing tensions. The U.S. Central Command released footage showing a Hellfire missile hitting the engine room of the Botswana-flagged tanker Lexi, leaving the vessel disabled. According to the U.S. military, the strike was part of measures linked to President Donald Trump's campaign to pressure Tehran into accepting a peace agreement. Ship tracking data showed the tanker's last known location near the Gulf of Oman before the reported strike. Conflicting statements emerged from Tehran and Washington over the status of negotiations aimed at ending the regional conflict. The Iranian media reported that Tehran had suspended message exchanges with the United States for several days regarding a proposed memorandum of understanding tied to ending the war. According to Iran's semi-official Fars news agency, the last communication sent from Tehran focused on developments in Lebanon. However, President Donald Trump denied reports that negotiations had stopped, saying talks between Washington and Tehran are continuing continuously. The conflicting statements highlight ongoing uncertainty surrounding diplomatic efforts amid escalating regional tensions. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington sees a possible opening in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program.
Now, we are in talks, and I say talks because talks with Iran are not like talks with Switzerland, okay? They're very different. They require the use of intermediaries, unfortunately. But there is the prospect before us, which could happen today, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, that for the first time, certainly in my memory, they have agreed to negotiate aspects of their nuclear program that just a month ago, just a year ago, they were refusing to even mention, much less enter into discussions about. That is not a guarantee that ultimately it will lead to a deal that's acceptable to the Senate or acceptable to the American people. But we'll be able to engage them in a process to truly test the proposition of how far they're willing to go.
Significant harm on the Iranian economy.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the country's armed forces remain on maximum alert amid continued tensions with the United States. According to Iran's semi-official Fars news agency, the Revolutionary Guard said all military positions remain at the highest level of readiness. IRGC spokesperson Sardar Mohebbi rejected U.S. claims that Iran's military capabilities have been weakened, saying Iranian forces are now more combat-ready than ever before. Mohebbi also said the United States failed to achieve its objectives in the Strait of Hormuz despite deploying major forces to the region. He added that Iran's control over the strategic waterway remains fully intact. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency said the UAE responded quickly after a drone attack targeted a nuclear power facility last month. The IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi said the agency is providing both technical and moral support to the United Arab Emirates following the incident at the Barakah nuclear power plant. Grossi said Emirati authorities acted rapidly by shutting down a reactor after the facility lost external power during the attack. He added that repair work and additional activities are planned at the site, but did not provide further details. Grossi also stressed that the IAEA would play an essential role in verifying and monitoring any future agreement related to Iran's nuclear program.
There is a fundamental change here because we are in a
Iran says it has fully reopened the application system for ships seeking passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian media reported that ship owners and captains worldwide can now apply electronically at any time for permits to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The report said passage approvals are being issued through a digital system overseen by Iranian authorities. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guard Navy said 24 vessels crossed the strategic waterway over the past 24 hours under coordination and protection from Iranian naval forces. Iran tightened control over the strait earlier this year following joint U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
UN peacekeepers were seen patrolling border areas between Lebanon and Israel as tensions remained high despite renewed diplomatic efforts. The video showed a convoy of United Nations peacekeeping vehicles moving through border areas where Israeli military forces maintained their presence. The deployment came as Israel continued strikes in southern Lebanon despite growing international pressure to prevent further escalation. Lebanese authorities said Israel agreed to avoid strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs following intervention by President Donald Trump, while Hezbollah would suspend attacks on Israel under the proposed arrangement. A hospital in southern Lebanon continued operating despite suffering major damage from nearby Israeli strikes. Jabal Amil Hospital in the city of Tyre remained operational after Israeli strikes hit nearby buildings and caused extensive damage to several departments and surrounding structures. Lebanon's health ministry said 4 people were killed and 127 others wounded in the attacks, including dozens of hospital staff members. Officials added that several doctors and nurses were among the injured, with 4 staff members reported in critical condition. The strikes came as Israel continued operations in southern Lebanon, despite renewed diplomatic efforts to prevent further escalation. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on both Israel and Hezbollah to show restraint and uphold the ceasefire in Lebanon. Speaking in Berlin alongside Hungarian Prime Minister Peter Magyar, Merz urged Hezbollah to immediately stop attacks on Israel and lay down its weapons. He also called on Israel to respect the ceasefire agreed upon in April and to protect civilians in southern Lebanon. The German Chancellor encouraged both Israel and Lebanon to continue direct talks aimed at reducing tensions and preventing further escalation in the region.
Im Südlibanon zu schützen. Wir ermutigen Israel.
The Israeli and Lebanese ambassadors to Washington held talks at the U.S. State Department amid rising tensions along the border. Israeli Ambassador Yichil Liter and the Lebanese Ambassador Nada Hamadi met at the State Department as fighting between Israel and Hezbollah continues to escalate. The meeting came a day after President Donald Trump urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to strike Beirut in an effort to prevent a broader regional confrontation. Meanwhile,
Will you extend the ceasefire to South Lebanon?
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing political criticism after the United States announced a ceasefire arrangement with Hezbollah. President Donald Trump said Israel and Hezbollah had agreed to halt attacks on one another, hours after Netanyahu ordered new strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs. Lebanon later announced a new ceasefire arrangement under which Israel would stop strikes on southern Beirut, while Hezbollah would suspend attacks on Israel. The developments triggered criticism from Netanyahu's political rivals, who accused him of yielding to U.S. pressure on matters related to Israeli national security ahead of elections expected later this year. Ladies and gentlemen, now we go live to Beirut's southern suburbs, where tensions remain extremely high following continued Israeli strikes and growing fears that the fragile understanding aimed at preventing a wider escalation could collapse at any moment. tensions remain high on the Lebanese front, despite renewed aimed at preventing a wider regional escalation. Israeli strikes have continued across southern Lebanon, while political and military contacts intensified amid growing international pressure to preserve the fragile ceasefire understandings. The latest developments come after President Donald Trump intervened to prevent Israeli strikes on Beirut's southern suburbs, warning against further escalation that could jeopardize broader regional negotiations involving Iran and the United States. Despite those efforts, Israeli military operations have continued across southern Lebanon, with strikes targeting multiple areas including Tyre, Nabatia, and parts of the Beqa Valley. Thick smoke was seen rising from several towns as Israeli forces pressed ahead with what they described as operations against Hezbollah infrastructure and fighters. On the ground, Israeli troops continue to maintain and expand military activity in southern Lebanon, where Israel says it has established a security zone aimed at protecting northern Israeli communities from Hezbollah attacks. Air raid sirens also sounded in northern Israel after missiles were launched from Lebanese territory. Meanwhile, Lebanon's health ministry says the death toll from the conflict since March 2nd has now exceeded 3,300, with more than 10,000 people wounded. The humanitarian situation is also deteriorating, particularly after strikes damaged civilian infrastructure and medical facilities. One of the most serious incidents involved the Jabal Amil hospital in the southern city of Tyre, which sustained heavy damage after nearby strikes. The Lebanese authorities said dozens of medical workers were among the injured, although the hospital continued operating despite the destruction. Diplomatic activity has also intensified. The Israeli ambassador to Washington and the Lebanese ambassador, Neda Hamadeh, held talks at the U.S. State Department as Washington seeks to prevent the conflict from expanding further. International concern is also growing. The United Nations has warned that the escalation threatens regional stability and called on all sides to respect the cessation of hostilities and protect civilians. Germany and several European countries have similarly urged restraint and renewed support for direct talks between Lebanon and Israel. At the same time, Hezbollah has maintained a cautious stance, while Iran warned that continued Israeli operations in Lebanon could undermine broader regional diplomacy and ongoing negotiations with Washington. With military operations continuing alongside diplomatic efforts, attention is now focused on whether the current understandings can hold or whether the region is moving towards a broader confrontation in the weeks ahead. While diplomatic efforts continue to prevent a wider escalation on the Lebanese front, the humanitarian and military situation in Gaza remains deeply volatile, the Israeli operations and civilian suffering continuing across the Strip. Hamas says it is prepared to hand over governance in Gaza to a nationally agreed technocratic committee. Hamas spokesperson Hazem Qasim said the movement is ready to transfer all areas of governance, including security responsibilities, to a national committee agreed upon in Cairo. Qasim rejected claims that Hamas is refusing to relinquish control of Gaza, describing such reports as a disinformation campaign aimed at justifying further Israeli operations. He also accused Israel and former UN envoy Nikolai Mladenov, now linked to the US-led Board of Peace Initiative, of obstructing the committee's work and preventing its entry into Gaza. The Egyptian Red Crescent has received the 45th batch of wounded and sick Palestinians at the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing, continuing its extensive and intensive humanitarian efforts. Patients and their companions were provided with full support, while those departing Egypt to Gaza were also assisted. Services included facilitating entry procedures and distributing hot meals, clothing, and personal care supplies to meet essential needs during their stay.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear. If you look at that, or we're out.
Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has praised the dedication and sacrifices of Egypt's armed forces, highlighting their pivotal role in safeguarding national security and fulfilling critical missions. His remarks came during a meeting with the senior military and presidential officials to review key operational and developmental files. According to the Egyptian presidency, discussions focused on the armed forces' contributions to national projects and their coordination with state institutions to enhance public services and advance Egypt's development vision. President al-Sisi stressed on the need to accelerate project implementation nationwide, ensuring precision and high technical standards to deliver a dignified life for citizens. He also commended the resilience of state institutions in confronting mounting regional and global challenges, underscoring Egypt's continued commitment to sustainable development. The United Nations strongly condemned Russia's latest wave of attacks on Ukraine after deadly overnight strikes hit multiple cities. In New York, the UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric said Secretary General Antonio Guterres strongly condemned the Russian attacks and renewed calls for immediate de-escalation and an unconditional ceasefire. Ukrainian officials said Russia launched hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles targeting cities including Kiev and Dnipro. Authorities reported at least 23 people killed and around 130 others wounded in one of the heaviest assaults in recent weeks. The escalation comes as diplomatic efforts to revive peace talks remain stalled. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that Russia could launch another large-scale attack following deadly overnight strikes across the country. In his nightly address, Zelensky said Russian forces may carry out another major assault after waves of drones and missiles targeted Ukrainian cities overnight. Ukrainian authorities said the attacks killed at least 22 people and wounded more than 100 others in strikes on Kiev, Dnipro, and other areas. The bombardment followed Russian warnings of what Moscow described as systematic attacks on the Ukrainian capital amid escalating tensions in the war.
Були влучання. 130 людей постраждали. На жаль. 22 людини.
The United States says it will re-engage with the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, as Ebola outbreaks spread in parts of Africa. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told lawmakers that Washington decided weeks ago to resume engagement with Gavi amid growing health concerns in Africa. The Vaccine Alliance supports lower-income countries in purchasing vaccines and also assists in responding to outbreaks, including Ebola. The move comes after the Trump administration suspended funding for the organization last year, following criticism from Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. over vaccine safety practices.
The current Ebola strain that has no vaccine right now. So, how are you making sure that...
A bear attack in northeastern Japan injured 4 people after the animal entered a business and residential area. Security footage from Fukushima Steel Works showed an Asian black bear chasing a worker near the factory entrance before knocking him to the ground. The bear later ran into a nearby building while being pursued by a vehicle inside the compound. Local media reported that 2 workers and an elderly woman in the surrounding neighborhood were among those injured in the incident. North Korea showcased student inventions and futuristic military-themed models at a science exhibition in Pyongyang. State media footage showed students and officials touring a national exhibition of science fiction models and inventions in Pyongyang. The displays included futuristic city models, robotic concepts, military ships, and aircraft designs featuring North Korean symbols. Officials said more than 340 inventions and models created by students were presented during the exhibition. Some participants said their projects were inspired by leader Kim Jong-un's calls to strengthen science, technology, and military capabilities. These are all the news we have for now, but before we go, let's take a look at the main headlines making news this hour. President Sisi stresses regional stability coordination. Washington dismisses Iranian claims of successful attacks on U.S. Gulf bases. And the IRGC says armed forces remain on maximum alert amid the U.S. tensions. That brings us to the end of this bulletin. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for watching Q News, your window to the latest developments from across the region and around the world.